Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Duties of the rulers and the ruled. The root of all that is knowledge, for there is no other way to learn of justice and injustice. The whole of religion is knowledge and justice, and the opposite is injustice and ignorance. God exalted said, "But man took it on, he is wrongful, ignorant." Chapter 33, verse 72. Since he is wrongful and ignorant, and the brunt of that comes sometimes from those in charge, sometimes from those in their care, and sometimes from others. Part of the knowledge and justice enjoined upon us is patient endurance of the injustice and tyranny of leaders. This being one of the principles of the people of the Sunnah and community. As the Prophet ﷺ commanded in his well known sayings, "After I am gone, you will encounter selfishness, so be patient till you meet me at the pool of paradise. Anyone who sees in his commander something he finds reprehensible should bear it patiently," and other similar sayings. He also said, "Give them their due and ask God to give you yours." They were forbidden to take up arms against them as long as they kept up the ritual prayer. That was because they retained the required basis of religion, namely the affirmation of God's unity and His worship, as well as some good deeds, and abstain from many wickednesses. As for the injustice and oppression perpetrated by them and justified by valid or invalid interpretation, it is not permissible to remove them on account of the further injustice and oppression involved. For the usual psychological tendency is to remove one evil with another that is even worse, and to remove one excess with something even more excessive. Coming out in revolt against them results in injustice and corruption, worse than their injustice. So it must be suffered with patience, as in many situations one must exercise patience in commanding the proper and forbidding the improper, despite the tyranny of those to whom the commands and prohibitions are addressed. As he says, "Command what is proper and forbid what is improper, and endure patiently whatever befalls you." Chapter 31, verse 17. And also God said, "Be patient, then, just as those steadfast messengers were patient." Chapter 46, verse 35. And also God says, "Patiently await your Lord's decree, for you are in our sight." Chapter 52, verse 48. This applies generally both to those in authority and to the people under them. If they command the proper and forbid the improper, they must endure patiently whatever afflicts them in the presence of God, just as those who fight the jihad endure with patience whatever affliction befalls themselves or their possessions. For patient endurance of pain in contingency is by far the better course. The benefit of command and prohibition can be realized in no other way, and what is essential to the performance of duty becomes a duty itself. This involves those in positions of authority, for patience and forbearance are incumbent upon them in great measure than upon others, as are courage and liberality. The benefit of command can be realized in no other way, and just as the leaders are obliged to endure patiently the offences and wrongs of those under them, this being essential to the common interest, since greater corruption otherwise ensues, so likewise is it incumbent on the people to bear with patience the oppression and injustice of the leaders to avoid causing still more corruption. Both the one in charge and those in his care have mutual obligations to discharge, as someone mentioned in the book of Jihad and Judgeship. Each must be patient and forbearing towards the other in various matters, And liberality and patience are essential in both. As the exalted one said, and exhort one another to patience and exhort one another to compassion. Chapter 90, verse 17. And according to the Hadith, the most excellent part of faith is liberality and patience. Moreover, among the names of God are all forgiving, all compassionate. Therefore, through forbearance, their bad deeds are pardoned, and through liberality, benefits accrue to them, so that the acquisition of benefit and the repelling of harm are combined. As for refraining from injustice towards them and treating them fairly, the necessity for this is even more apparent and needs no clarification. But God knows best. The gradations of sinful offenses. As for their gradations in the hereafter, this subject is discussed elsewhere. All that we are concerned with here is their gradations in this world, in terms of blame and punishment. I have previously mentioned that offenses involving injustice to others and injury to them, be it in the religious or worldly sense, are more severely punished in this world than those not entailing harm to others, despite the fact that the punishment for the latter may be greater in the hereafter. For instance, Muslim criminals are subject to harsher penalties than unbelievers enjoying Muslim protection, although in the hereafter the unbeliever will be punished more severely than the Muslim. The latter may be punished despite his integrity, for example, one who drinks spirits, nabis, and justifies his doing so by an interpretation according to which they are not unlawful, or rebels who interpret their revolt as being legitimate, whereas the unrighteous who tries to hide his offense may get off lightly. The propagandist for a heretical innovation and the exponent of impropriety will be punished more severely than the hypocrite who conceals his hypocrisy and does not advocate it to others. These examples contrast the unbeliever and the impious and the honest, the hypocrite and the believer who openly advocates an heretical innovation or offense. The reason is clear. These punishments are designed to protect religious and worldly interests from the wrong of wrongdoers, whereas the punishment of those who wrong only themselves is left to their Lord. The overall picture is that all sinful offenses are wrong, but while it is one thing for a creature to wrong himself, if wrong is done to others, it is necessary to have legal sanctions to protect religious and worldly interests against the wrong of the wrongdoer. As the exalted one said, sanction is given to those who fight because they have been wronged. God is indeed able to give them victory. Chapter 22, verse 39. Thus, he makes the fact that they have been wronged the legitimate reason for punishing others by fighting them. He also said, fight them till there is no more persecution and religion is entirely God's. But if they desist, then no hostility except against wrongdoers. Chapter 2, verse 193. Here, God explains that aggressive action is to be taken against the wrongdoer, that is to say, by overstepping the normal bounds where he is concerned. This is punishment and this is permissible hostility, as he said. If someone attacks you, attack him just as he attacked you. Chapter 2, verse 194. Some say that this is not really hostility, but only called by that name by way of comparison, but there is no need for this, nor for their similar comment on his words, as God said, the recompense for an injury is an injury similar to it. Chapter 42, verse 40. Because unqualified hostility means overstepping the bounds in general, and this is not permissible with regard to anyone unless he has committed aggression, in which case the limit may be exceeded where he is concerned in proportion to his transgression. Injury is simply the name for what injures a person. For misfortunes and punishments are equally termed injury in several places in the book of God. Exalted is he. Wrong is of two kinds, neglect of right and transgressing the limit. The former, that is, neglect of right, is failure to perform what is due to another, such as failure to settle debts or to discharge other trusts and financial obligations. The second is aggressive conduct, like murder and seizing property. Both constitute wrong. This is why the Prophet, on him be peace, said in a generally accepted tradition, delay in payment by the wealthy is wrong, and if one of you prosecutes a man who is solvent, he may do so. Thus he makes it wrong to procrastinate, that is to delay payment when able to pay. What then of not paying at all? The exalted one said, They consult you about women, say God pronounces on them for you, and what is recited for you in the book concerning female orphans to whom you do not give what is ordained for them, though you desire to marry them, and that you should deal with the orphans fairly. Chapter 4, verse 127. Aisha radiallahu anha, may God be pleased with her, said, this refers to the female orphan under the care of her guardian, who wishes to marry her without treating her fairly in the matter of her dower. So God calls giving the full dower fair treatment, and the opposite of this is injustice. This is generally self evident, unanimously accepted by all the Muslims, that justice may consist in fulfilling an obligation, or in avoiding something unlawful, or in a combination of the two, and that injustice also may consist in neglecting an obligation, or in doing something unlawful, or in a combination of the two. This being well known, it is also common knowledge that justice and injustice may affect a person himself and may affect the rights of others, as mentioned previously. While I explained that all good deeds are included in justice and all bad deeds are included in injustice, a number of useful points now emerge. One of these is that Muslims in positions of authority, whether as scholars or as commanders, as well as their subordinates, all have obligations towards people. Each rank has particular duties which it is required to perform, although these may not be demanded of another grade, being less essential to it and therefore not obligatory. Likewise, certain things may be unlawful to a man by virtue of his rank, while to those of different rank they are either not unlawful at all or to a lesser extent. Fighting its rationale. Struggling in the way of God will serve as an example of this, for it is incumbent on the Muslims in general and on a sufficient number of them at any time. It may sometimes become a duty for particular individuals, but the obligation is more definite in the case of those retainers who are given funds out of booty for the sake of the struggle in the way of Allah. Indeed, it is an obligation on them individually imposed on them by the sacred law and by the contract they entered into when they contracted with those in authority to serve in the struggle in the way of God, and made binding by the financial consideration. For even if it were not obligatory by law or through loyalty to the Imam, it would still be made obligatory by the commutative contract, just as the employee is obliged to work when he accepts his wage, and as the seller is obliged to hand over goods for which he has taken the price. Here the obligation stems from the commutative contract and the taking of a consideration, whereas in the first case the obligation lies in the sacred law and the mere act of loyalty to the Imam. It is also incumbent from the point of view of the danger to the Muslims entailed by its neglect, and the harm attaching to them through neglect of it creates the obligation to act responsibly in respect of what one guarantees. The professional soldiers, Murtazika, guarantee the defense of the Muslims in return for their stipends. People have come to rely on this and are content to leave their own defense to them, even more than they rely on trustees and agents to manage their affairs and businesses. If some of those in whom trust has been reposed are extravagant and wasteful, therefore the damage to the Muslims is enormous, for they cause great detriment to both the religious and worldly interests of the Muslims by neglecting their duty to fight for them. This has prejudicial consequences for the Muslims in the religious and worldly spheres alike, affecting themselves, their posterity, and their property to an incalculable degree. For the fighting men to abandon the struggling in the way of Allah on behalf of the Muslims is therefore one of the greatest wrongs possible, in contrast to the harm attaching to one of them, since that is wrong done to himself. Likewise, any private offense he commits, such as drinking wine or an act of immorality, for this is wrong done to himself and affecting only him. Therefore, his punishment for neglecting the struggling in the way of Allah and the blame he incurs is greater by far than for the other offenses. If it is not possible to combine the two punishments, the penalty for neglecting the struggle in the way of Allah must take precedence over that for other offenses, just as the benefit of the struggling in the way of Allah to him and all the Muslims would be far greater than the benefit of deterring him from wine drinking and immorality. If he kept this secret and did not wrong others by it, in this case the greater corruption should be guarded against by tolerating the lesser. Concerning this kind of thing, the Prophet on him be peace said, God will support this religion with the aid of the dissolute and people who have no morals. This kind of person is rebuked or rewarded according to his slackness or extravagance in the struggling in the way of Allah, differently from others who are not equipped for the struggling in the way of God.